Of pot roast was the first thing I noticed when I walked into my grandmother's house that Thanksgiving. The second thing I noticed was that my chair, the one I'd sat in every holiday for 27 years, the one closest to the window where Grandma liked to watch the snow, had someone else in it. Not just someone. My stepfather's daughter, Kelsey, 19 years old, visiting from college, wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings. My stepfather, Dennis, looked up from across the table and said, "Oh, we rearranged the seating. Kelsey needed more space for her. You know, she has a condition with her back." He waved his hand like he was shooing a fly. "You can sit at the end." The end. The folding chair they kept in the garage. I sat down. I smiled. I passed the green bean casserole when it came around. But that night in the bathroom of my grandmother's house, I pressed my back against the cold tile and made myself breathe. Because I had seen something that afternoon while everyone was watching football. I had seen Dennis slip into my grandmother's study and close the door. And I had seen through the crack him taking photographs of documents on her desk with his phone. My grandmother was 79. She had a mild stroke 18 months earlier. And Dennis had been married to my mother for 3 years. I was a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. I knew what estate documents look like. I want to tell you that I confronted him that night, that I swept the casserole off the table and pointed at him and said, "I know what you're doing, but that's not what happened. What happened is that I drove home in the dark and I could not stop shaking and I did not sleep at all. And at 4 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I thought about my grandmother's hands. She had the same hands as my father. He died when I was 16, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to gone. He left behind a house, a small business he'd spent 20 years building, a regional HVAC company with 12 employees, and a will that left everything in equal thirds to my mother, to me, and to my younger brother, Owen. I was supposed to inherit my portion at 25, Owen at 25 as well. My mother met Dennis 14 months after my father's funeral. He showed up at her grief support group at St. Group, Michael's, which I always thought was a strange place to meet someone, a room full of people at the worst point of their lives. But my mother said he was kind. She said he listened. She said he made her feel less alone. I tried to be fair. I really did. Dennis was polite enough in that surface way that certain men are polite. He opened car doors, he remembered birthdays. He said please and thank you with a precision that always felt slightly rehearsed. He had a daughter from a previous marriage, Kelsey, who came around for holidays and never quite looked at me directly. He sold commercial real estate. He drove a car that was a little too nice for the income he described. The first time something felt genuinely wrong was about 8 months into the marriage, when my mother mentioned that she was thinking of changing her estate plan. "Dennis thinks it's more efficient to consolidate," she said. We were on the phone. She was in the kitchen. I could hear the exhaust fan. "He has a financial advisor he really trusts, someone who works specifically with blended families." I asked her the advisor's name. She said she'd have to look it up. She never did send it to me. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself grief made me suspicious. I told myself a lot of things for about 2 years. Then came Thanksgiving, and the pearl earrings and the photographs through the study door. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I went to work and I pulled every resource I could access without crossing any lines. I was not an attorney. I was careful about that. But I knew people, and I knew what questions to ask, and I knew that what I had seen was not nothing. The financial advisor Dennis had recommended to my mother was a man named Philip Garrett O.C. He went by Phil, who was not a licensed fiduciary. He held a general securities registration that had 2 complaint notations in FINRA's broker check database. One complaint had been settled quietly in 2019. The other was still pending. That was the first thread. The second thread came from my grandmother's neighbor, a retired school teacher named Evelyn, who had lived next door for 31 years and who called my grandmother every Sunday morning. Evelyn told me, when I called her, because I didn't know who else to talk to, that a man matching Dennis's description had come to the house 3 times in October, that my grandmother had seemed a little confused on the phone recently, that she'd mentioned signing some paperwork but couldn't remember exactly what it was. I want to tell you that I stayed calm when Evelyn said that. I want to tell you that I was professional and measured and thanked her and hung up, and then calmly made a plan. I cried in my car for 20 minutes. Then I made the plan. I called my brother Owen first. He was living in Denver at the time, working in tech, and we had not spoken as often as we should have since our father died. Grief does that to families sometimes, spreads them out instead of pulling them together. When I told him what I suspected, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Has been worried about the business." The business. My father's company. Owen said that 6 months ago, our mother had mentioned that Dennis was helping manage some of the operational side because the business manager my father had trusted for years, a man named Roy, had retired. Owen had assumed it was fine. He hadn't asked questions. Neither of us had asked enough questions. I drove to my grandmother's house the following Saturday on the pretext of bringing her the cranberry preserves she'd asked me to order online. I sat with her for 2 hours. We drank tea. She showed me photographs from a trip she'd taken to Portugal in 1987. She was sharp, mostly. She remembered things from decades ago with perfect clarity. But when I gently asked her about the paperwork she'd signed in October, she frowned and said, "Dennis said it was a trust document. He said it would protect the house from probate. He brought someone to witness it. Do you have a copy, Grandma?" She looked uncertain. He said he'd keep it with his files, that it was safer. I kept my voice even. "Did your own attorney look at it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He said my attorney would charge too much for something so simple." I reached across the table and held her hand. That night I called the attorney who had drawn up my father's original will, a woman named Patricia Hollis who had been practicing estate law in our county for 30 years. I was not her client, but she had known my father, and she remembered our family. And when I explained what I believed was happening, she told me to come in Monday morning and to bring everything I had. What I had wasn't much. Notes from my conversation with Evelyn, the FINRA complaint records I'd printed, a timeline I'd put together of Dennis's involvement with my mother's finances and my grandmother's estate, a memory of a phone photograph taken through a study door. Patricia listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "This is going to require a capacity evaluation for your grandmother, and you'll need her cooperation." "She'll cooperate," I said. "She just doesn't know yet how much there is to be concerned about." The next 3 weeks were the quietest I've ever been in my life. I went to work, I came home, I spoke to my mother twice on the phone, and I said nothing, not because I didn't love her, but because I knew that if Dennis found out what I was doing, documents would disappear, accounts would move, the window would close. My mother's birthday fell on a Sunday in the first week of December. Dennis planned a dinner at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a prix-fixe menu, the kind of place that signals I am a generous man to everyone watching. My mother wore a blue dress. Kelsey came. Owen flew in from Denver because he and I had agreed that we needed to be together for this, that whatever happened next, we were doing it as a family. Owen and I had coffee that morning before the dinner. He'd spoken to a CPA who specialized in business forensics, someone he'd found through a colleague in Denver. The CPA had reviewed what records Owen could access. As a partial heir to the business, he had some standing. And what he found was that in the 14 months since Dennis had become involved in the operational side of our father's company, 3 significant vendor contracts had been redirected to a Shell LLC registered in Nevada. The LLC's registered agent was Phil O.C. I put my coffee cup down on the table and I looked at my brother and I thought about my father, about the 12 employees who still worked at that company, about the people who had trusted him and by extension us. "We go to the Attorney General's office," Owen said. "Fraud unit." "Yes," I said. After the birthday dinner. After the birthday dinner. The dinner was excruciating in the way that certain dinners are excruciating. Beautiful on the surface, the kind of meal you describe to someone later as lovely. The kind where you sit with your spine very straight and laugh at the right moments and watch a man who is stealing from your family refill his wine glass and make a toast to your mother's health. Dennis looked at me once across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not suspicious exactly, more like satisfied, like a man who believed he had already won something. I smiled back. On Monday morning, Owen and I went to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection and Fraud Division together. We brought the FinRay records, Owen's CPA report on the LLC, my timeline, Patricia Hollis's preliminary assessment of the trust document, which she had, through her own contacts, managed to obtain a copy of, and which contained language that misrepresented my grandmother's wishes in a way that Patricia called significant and actionable, and a folder of emails that Owen had found in an account my father had set up for business records, an account that Dennis apparently hadn't known existed. My father had been meticulous. He kept records the way some people keep journals, thoroughly, consistently, with an eye toward the future. In those emails were months of correspondence between my father and Roy, the former business manager, documenting concerns Roy had raised about a man named Phil O.C., who had been circling the business community in our county, approaching newly widowed or recently bereaved business owners. My father had flagged it. He had sent a note to his attorney. He had made a record. He died before Dennis ever entered our lives. He had no way to know his warning would become relevant, but he had made the record anyway, because that was who he was. When I read those emails for the first time, sitting at my kitchen table the night before we went to the Attorney General's office, I had to stop and put my face in my hands. Not because I was falling apart, because something in my chest that had been clenched for 2 years finally, slowly unclenched. He hadn't known. He couldn't have known. But he had done the thing he could do, and it had been enough. He had done the thing he could do, and it had been enough. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation in January. The fraud unit was particularly interested in the Shell LLC and its connections to Phil O.C., because it turned out our case was not the first inquiry involving O.C.'s name. He had appeared in 2 other investigations in neighboring counties, both involving estates of elderly or recently bereaved clients. The investigators were already building something. We had given them a significant piece of it. I didn't tell my mother what was happening until the second week of January, when Patricia Hollis sat down with her privately and walked her through the trust document and what it actually said versus what Dennis had told her it said. I asked Patricia to do it without me in the room because I knew my mother would need space to react in a way she might not allow herself if I was watching. My mother called me that night at 8:30. She didn't say anything for the first few seconds. Then she said, "I feel so stupid." "You're not stupid," I said. "You were grieving and someone paid attention to that very carefully. That's not stupid. That's being human." She cried for a while. I stayed on the phone. Dennis moved out of the house in the 3rd week of January after my mother retained her own family law attorney and filed for divorce. He did not go quietly. There was a period of about 3 weeks where he attempted to characterize me and Owen as manipulative and estranged, where he told people at my mother's church that we had never accepted him, that we were sabotaging a marriage out of grief that had curdled into resentment. A few people believed him. A few people always do. My mother's friend Rochelle called me during that period, and I could hear in her voice that she wasn't sure what to think. I told her I understood and that I hoped she would wait and see, and that I wasn't asking her to take a side. I meant it. I have found in my life that the truth doesn't need to be argued. It needs to be documented and then released. The civil case against Dennis and O.C. moved forward through the spring. The Nevada LLC was dissolved. 3 vendor contracts were unwound, and the funds were traced and partially recovered, not everything but enough. The 12 employees at my father's company still had jobs. The business manager who replaced Roy, a woman named Frederica who Owen found through an industry contact in Denver, was exactly what the company needed. She was organized, experienced, and had absolutely no connection to Phil O.C. My grandmother's trust document was invalidated. She executed a new one with Patricia Hollis in a meeting that I attended, and that took 2 hours and involved my grandmother reading every single paragraph aloud before she signed anything. She wore her pearl earrings to that meeting. She had taken them back from Kelsey at Christmas, quietly and without drama, the way my grandmother did most things. The divorce was finalized in August. My mother got the house. She got her share of my father's estate back to the extent it could be recovered. She also got, I think, something harder to name, a clearer view of a chapter of her life that had been difficult to see clearly while she was living inside it. I got something too. I got my brother back in the way that doing something hard together gives you a person back. Owen and I talk now every Sunday, the same time slot Evelyn uses to call my grandmother, though I didn't plan it that way. We talk about the business and about what we're building with it and about our father, and sometimes we just talk the way siblings should. At Thanksgiving this year, I sat by the window. My grandmother passed me the green bean casserole first, the way she always had, the way she had for 27 years. The pearl earrings caught the light when she turned her head. After dinner, when everyone was helping clean up, she came and stood next to me at the kitchen sink and she said, very quietly, "Your father would be proud of you." I kept washing the dish I was washing. I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. Then I said, "I know. I think he actually already was." People ask me sometimes if I regret staying quiet for so long. 2 years of watching, of telling myself I was being uncharitable, of swallowing things that should have been said out loud. And honestly, no, I don't regret it. Not because silence is always the right answer, but because I wasn't actually silent. I was building something. I just didn't know it yet. There's a version of this story where I confront Dennis at Thanksgiving dinner, where I stand up from the folding chair and say everything I'd been thinking for 2 years in front of my mother and my grandmother and Kelsey in those pearl earrings. Maybe it feels satisfying for about 30 seconds. And then Dennis gets quiet and calculating, and documents disappear, and accounts get moved, and the window closes. I've thought about that version a lot. It ends badly. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, not just understood as a concept, is that there is a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is what happens when emotion moves faster than thought. Responding is what happens when you slow down enough to ask, what do I actually want the outcome to be? Dennis wanted me emotional. Emotional people make mistakes. Emotional people say things they can't prove and make accusations they can't back up and give the other person exactly the ammunition they need. I am my father's daughter. He kept records. He documented things quietly and thoroughly and with an eye toward the future, even when the future he was protecting against hadn't arrived yet. He did not know Dennis. He could not have predicted any of it. But he was the kind of person who understood that the careful, unglamorous work, the filing, the correspondence, the paper trail, is what holds when everything else shakes. I inherited that. It took me a long time to understand it was an inheritance worth something. Owen and I had drifted in the years after our father died. That part still sits with me. Grief is supposed to bring people together, and sometimes it does. But sometimes it just makes everyone go very quiet in their own separate rooms. We lost time. I think about the Sundays we didn't talk, the years we were just two people who shared a last name and a loss and not much else. What brought us back wasn't a holiday or a milestone. It was a crisis. It was sitting across from each other in a coffee shop in December with a CPA report between us and the shared understanding that someone had been counting on us not to be paying attention. I am glad we were paying attention. I am glad it wasn't too late. The thing about people like Dennis and Phil O.C. and everyone like them is that they depend on a very specific set of conditions. They need grief. They need isolation. They need the people who might catch them to be too uncomfortable, too conflict-averse, too worried about being wrong to act. They are very good at leading rooms and finding the path of least resistance. What they cannot survive is documentation and a family that decides to act like one again. My grandmother sat in Patricia's office and read every paragraph of her new trust document out loud before she signed it. She was 79 years old and she read every word. I watched her and I thought, this is what it looks like to take care of yourself. Not the dramatic version, not the confrontational version. Just the quiet, thorough, non-negotiable version. She taught me something in that room without meaning to. I think about what I want to carry forward from all of this, not the anger. Anger has its place, but it doesn't make a good long-term companion. What I want to carry forward is the part where Owen and I sat at that kitchen table and decided together. The part where I called Evelyn and she told me the truth because I asked directly. The part where Patricia said this is actionable, and I felt the ground come back under my feet. The ground was always there. I just had to stop letting other people tell me it wasn't.